What's that? Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Alright, let's see if this is doing what I need it to do. Perfect.
Good morning.
Morning. Alrighty. So, this is where we ended last time. Any questions from you guys before we get back into things? Okay, just as a reminder, since this is Chapter 19, once we finish this chapter, we'll do the review and then have the next test. And we are about halfway through now, so we'll probably be getting towards the end of it today. We might finish today, I don't know yet. We had about this much left in my Tuesday, Thursday class yesterday, and we didn't quite finish it, so we'll see what happens. But at the most, if we finish it today, we'll still have the review next Monday and then the test on Wednesday, so we're not jumping straight to the test next time. Need a pen? That's all I got. I don't think I have this up on Blackboard yet. I will do that after class today. Oop. And also put the study guide up as well, since we are very near the end of the chapter now, or we will be after class. Just so you guys will have that to look at. But I'll do that, like I said, after class. Okay. Bless you. Alright. So we talked about the start of the morality and social control section with prohibition. Which I made some jokes about, like, oh, Kansas was the first one to do this because, Kansas is a real boring state. Why would they do that? The thing about prohibition is, to start with, go back to literally the Middle Ages. Alcohol consumption was a thing because water was not always clean. And if you get a waterborne parasite or bacteria or whatever, and it gives you any number of diseases, it will kill you. The most common thing, if you were to drink bad water, is it would give you either diarrhea or cause you to vomit, which is going to dehydrate you, because when you get sick, one of the most common things, stay hydrated. Well, if you're in a place and a time when you can't get access to clean water, and you're drinking water that has diseases in it, it's not going to make you any better. It's just going to make you continuously more and more sick, and you die. But the thing about alcohol is, when it's being made, one of the parts of the process is boiling it. And therefore, it's cleaner than water in most of these places. So, and also, back again, Middle Ages, it was not high alcohol content. It had alcohol in it, obviously. Again, it was alcohol, but it wasn't like something that you drank to get drunk. It was just a safer alternative. And a lot of times people would drink it as sort of a chaser to water. To It was more of a healthy thing than something you drank for the sake of drinking. However, when the Industrial Revolution happened and people went from working farms to working in these big industrial factories, and it changed like the social dynamic, people started drinking to get drunk because of the social and emotional stress of the industrial mechanization shift of what all this did. So, that being said, Prohibition was a response to that, because women, those that weren't also working in the factories, would be home, and then their husbands would arrive drunk, often very abusive, and they wanted to prevent that from happening, which is why most of these prohibition groups were led by women, because they were trying to protect themselves and their households from this scourge of drunkenness, which again is why we have like this here. It's not just a guy going out and getting drunk and eventually killing himself. It's the suffering of his family as well. And then also, like the children and how it's affecting, well, there's also that, but that was sort of a weird thing. And like not just men coming home drunk and abusive, but also spending the family's meager income on alcohol. So there's a lot of various aspects to it, not just alcohol bad, we should get rid of it. There is still, though, this weird thing where it's like a saloonless nation and a stainless flag. This is the only problem we've ever had in our country. Yeah. Speaking of, we're going to go into another thing. This is also within the morality and social control section, but last time we only did the prohibition. So there was a push to end prostitution, which, similar to the prohibition, it came from a number of different reasons. There was, of course, the issue of health because of STDs running rampant, because there was no kind of understanding of quite how that worked. Concern of the virtue of the women involved. McClure's magazine in 1907 ran a report on prostitution in Chicago, calling it white slavery. Of course, white women weren't the only ones that were oftentimes forced into prostitution. Black and Asian women were very much forced into it, especially those that were immigrants. But because this is early 1900s America, that isn't going to sell newspapers, so we're only concerned about the white women. And boy, it just gets worse. 1915, all states had laws against sexual solicitation. This began with the White Slave Trade Act in 1910. This was pushed by Representative James Mann. This was also known as the Mann Act, because of course it was. And like many acts passed through Congress, it had other aspects behind it besides just the whole, like, ending prostitution for the sake of the women involved. It also was working to enforce traditional racial behavior because, again, this is the early 1900s and it's insane. So the reason for this was in 1910, there was a heavyweight championship fight. Jack Johnson, who was an African-American boxer, defeated the heavyweight champion Jim Jeffries, which upset a lot of racist white men, which is to say, most white men in America. so many of these whites were very upset with this, and by 1913, Jack Johnson was prosecuted on moral charges due to his relations with white women. He was literally arrested for laws that were made up because they were upset with him for being good at boxing. There's also the issue of narcotics, which is less of a gray area. Narcotics were an issue. 250,000 Americans were addicted to opium, morphine, or cocaine. Because prior to this, it was just everybody did it. This is where I bring up the point of if you ever, when you're in, say, English class and you read Edgar Allan Poe, it's like, man, where was he getting this stuff? It was typically the opium, because in the 1800s, especially the late 1800s, people smoked opium the way in the 1950s, if you ever watch like a movie from the 50s, people would smoke cigarettes. It was just the norm. Eventually, we had the Harrison Narcotics Control Act that banned narcotics except for medicinal purposes. Of course, we have, the opioid crisis in the modern day where doctors were making lots of money by pushing opioids on their patients. So even though we have this, it didn't exactly stop the problem. So here we have the Great War on White Slavery, or fighting for the protection of our girls. Yeah. Another one here, fighting the traffic in young girls. For God's sake, do something, says General Booth, or the war on white slavery. And then here at the bottom, the greatest crime in the world's history, ignoring all the genocide and slavery and whatnot that literally this country has done. But yes, 100% just the white women that were trafficked in prostitution, which I'm not saying it's not a bad thing. It's certainly a terrible thing. But also not widespread and systematic like all the other stuff has been. Surprisingly, we do actually have a thing here about immigrant girls being picked up at the docks and forced into this. Although it does specifically say thousands of girls arriving in America from Italy, Sweden, Germany, etc. are never heard from again. Very white nations. We're not worried about people arriving from, say, Japan or China or more Eastern European nations. I'm honestly surprised Italy is in there. And there's the weird vice octopus in Chicago. And Jack Johnson about to plant Jim Jeffries in the ground. Oh, did I not have... Oh, no, I did that later. For some reason, the Harrison Narcotics Control Act, I didn't have the images that I thought I did. I've got another thing in a little bit with other stuff. Okay. So, even though we had at the start of the chapter the settlement houses and whatnot with it's not the fault of the immigrants and the poor that they're in the situations that they're in. Very quickly, it just went back around to, it's the immigrants' fault that they're immoral. They're just immoral on purpose. There were these social scientists that depicted other races as inferior to whites because, religious bigotry, Catholics and Jews were seen as dangerous to Christianity, even though, again, Catholicism is like OG Christianity. So in this case, Christianity is just another term for Protestantism. But again, whatever. It's America. We're very America-centric here. Um, of course, when it came to immigrants, Asians got the worst of it. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which we've talked about already. It kept out all Chinese immigrants, and then those that were already here were not allowed to become citizens. 1908, Theodore Roosevelt entered into a restricted immigration agreement with Japan. The thing about that is, while this was further restricting people from a specific nation, this was specifically an agreement with that government, because Japan has always been real weird about letting their people leave their country. Like, even to this day, the government is still not big on letting their people leave. And government-wise, I'm not going to speak on the people of Japan, but government-wise, they're still, like, really ethno-nationalistic. And it's very hard to become a citizen of Japan if you were not born there. So I can see them agreeing to a immigration restriction thing. That said, there were further restrictions done by the states. This began in California that barred all Japanese immigrants from buying land, just making it difficult / impossible for the Japanese immigrants to settle down. And most of them would be farmers, so it's very difficult to be a farmer if you can't own the land that you're living on / farming. And then 12 other states did the same thing. And of course, these would be Western states, which would be where these people would be living, because they're coming from across the Pacific. And then in 1917, Congress passed more legislation, banning illiterates who cannot read English or their native tongue, banning entry to other undesirables like alcoholics, feeble-minded persons, whatever that means, epileptics, which is back then means more than just people who have epilepsy. That just is a broad term for lots of different mental disorders. People mentally or physically defective, again, very broad. Professional beggars, whatever that means. Anarchists and polygamists. So just the whole, like, send us your poor unwashed masses. Not really a thing anymore. Send us people except for all of these. And then here I talked about this back when we mentioned the Chinese immigration restriction. So you have here in Uncle Sam's hand protests against Russian exclusion of Jewish Americans, and in Uncle Sam's calls it the American exclusion of the Chinese, because while we are more than content to protest against other countries doing things, we often have done those things already, but we just pretend like we haven't. And while this is obviously a cartoon that's being negative towards our treatment of Chinese immigrants, there's others that were much more positive, such as Pacific chivalry, encouragement to Chinese immigration. Yeah. I mean, and then even the back, too. Courts of justice closed to Chinese, extra taxes, too, and then there's this really old, awful slur for Chinese there. That's a thing. August 7th, 1869, so that's an old one. The WASP, what we would like to see, where you've got the Chinese on one side, and I guess that's like European socialist / communist on the other. If you're not familiar with what WASP means, that's White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's what a lot of white nationalists believe, that should be the only people in America. This one, I don't remember exactly why I put this in here. This is also the Franco-Prussian, the Russo-Japanese War with Korea caught in the middle. I think this also, there was a lot of Korean immigration during this time period because Korea was caught in the middle of two countries at war. And we weren't exactly being nice to them either. Oh, and while this is largely talking about Asian immigrants, we were also pretty rough against different European immigrants. This is a depiction of an Irishman, who, if you can tell from the depiction, is very simian in appearance. Is also sitting on a gunpowder barrel with a lit torch and a bottle of whiskey in the other hand. Granted, I believe this is in response to the Sinn Féin attempted invasion of Canada through the U.S., which would have, they hoped, caused America and Canada to go to war, which would have then caused Britain to get involved, which would have helped Ireland, hopefully in their minds, finally get rid of British control, but that plot got exposed and it didn't quite work out for them. So then all Irish got painted with the same brush of like drunken terrorists, essentially. And we have the very qualified land of the free literacy test. Uncle Sam, you're welcome in if you can climb it. Yeah. And then more immigration restriction from Europe. So, on to what the book describes as good government progressivism. So, the cities are continuing to grow, and the governments in the cities were not working for what the cities needed. The graft and corruption that we had with the political machines was proof that the cities needed something different. So the commission form of government was what came out of this. Now, while this was certainly a necessary step, it didn't come about, I mean, I guess it technically came about naturally because it was due to a natural disaster, but it didn't come about through, like, the vote and people gradually moving from these political machines into this commission form of government. It resulted, due to 1900, a hurricane rolling through and wiping Galveston, Texas off the map. If you're familiar with Galveston, Texas, it tends to get hit by a pretty major hurricane every couple of years. It's not like Florida, which gets hit by multiple major hurricanes every year. But every so often, Galveston gets hit by a pretty bad hurricane. And 1900 was one such time. And the whole political machines, party boss, etc., they weren't able to organize enough to rebuild the city, essentially. So this was replaced with a mayor and a city council. The old form of government with the mayor and city council was replaced by elected commissioners, and each ran their departments like a business. And this was more efficient than what they had before. And this was so efficient that by 1917, this had taken hold in 400 cities all across the country, which didn't have to be destroyed by a hurricane in order to change. Now, that said, in order to go from these entrenched, corrupt political machines to the Commission of Form of Government, the reformers did have to use some different tactics. For example, direct elections, at-large elections. So direct elections, for example, so that the politicians wouldn't just elect the civil leaders themselves. At-large elections to avoid the districts. If you've ever seen like city districts, if you've ever seen a map of a city districts, plural, you may know they're shaped real weird, typically. They're very rarely just gridded out equally. That's known as gerrymandering, because I've seen examples where you can have like a city that is literally population-wise 50%. We'll just go Republican, Democrat, 50% Republican, 50% Democrat. But you can district it in such a way that basically you can get 80% votes for one side and 20% for the other. Because people aren't going to live identically all over the place. So you can draw the lines in such a way that each district will have a majority of whichever side you're trying to have win, and then suddenly, oh look, 4 of your 5 districts are majority this group, therefore 4 of your 5 elected officials are that group, even if they're 50-50 population-wise, or sometimes even like 60-40, or even more one side than the other. But gerrymandering, which should be illegal, but every time it's attempted to be made illegal, the politicians that are in charge are benefiting from it, so nothing ever is actually done of it. And it's been that way for decades. I was in grade school when I learned about it, and it's like, oh yeah, they've been trying to do stuff about it for a long time, and nothing ever comes of it. So these at-large elections are just like, get rid of the districts entirely, and it votes from the entire city. But that's also pretty rare. So as we had these city and state governments, they began working to help the working class, women and children. By 1913, 3/4 of the states had ratified the 17th Amendment. They made senators elected by popular vote, which again wasn't a thing before this point. Before, you would just elect your local state representatives. So whatever your, again, just to use our states, South Carolina legislatures that stayed here in the state, and they would select whoever went to Washington. You actually had no say in your senators. Well, due to the 17th Amendment, they did now. And that was, if you remember from, I think it was 2 chapters ago now, that was something that the populists pushed. So we have, once again, a populist ideal that is being put into practice, well, at least in this case, 2 chapters later, but literally decades later by a completely different group. Bless you. Also, when I said Galveston was wiped off the map, I meant it. There was very little left of the city after that hurricane came through. This was before, obviously, there was much meteorological data, so they didn't have names for the hurricanes. The hurricanes were just like the hurricane of this year. So yeah, there was not a lot left. And in addition to a new government type, they also built this big seawall. Because if you're familiar with how hurricanes work, which, considering where we are in the state, we should be pretty familiar with how hurricanes work. The the storm surge is the worst. Like where we are, we get rain and wind and certainly flooding. We don't get the storm surge. We don't get the seas rising like 20 feet. This would at least help that part of it. Then here's also like a little thing on indirect democracy before the 17th Amendment, because before then, like I said, you didn't have direct control over who went to Washington, which kind of sucks. All right. So there are also progressive efforts that aim towards the environment. Gifford Pinchot, who was the chief forester in the Department of Agriculture, pushed for efficient use of natural resources, which is to say, lumber companies should not clear-cut forest. Because if you clear-cut a forest, all the tree, well, obviously if you clear-cut a forest, all the trees are going to be gone. And if you don't know, it's the roots of the trees that keep the land where it's supposed to be. So most of the times, most of the forests are going to be on hills and whatnot. So if you clear-cut a forest, that hill is just going to be a pile of dirt, and the next big rain that comes through is going to cause a mudslide. And any settlements that are nearby are going to be destroyed. So to avoid that, you should only cut down certain trees and then replant afterwards, which is more costly, but it means that you're not destroying entire ecosystems and, again, also nearby towns. The larger lumber companies were fine with this because while it was more expensive, it also cut out smaller competitors and made it easier for them to do their business. So, again, more regulation is harder for smaller businesses, but like it's better in the long run. The big challenge to this would come in California. In 1906, there was another major natural disaster. This was the 1906 earthquake that destroyed most of San Francisco. This was another thing I remember from like grade school that I did a report on that stuck with me. The thing about this particular earthquake, not only did it destroy like most of the buildings, but most of the lighting in the city was gassed. So it broke the gas lines and then set fire to most of the city. Also, because again, earthquake is shaking the ground, it broke all the water lines, so you couldn't even put out the fires. So the city just burned. So obviously this caused massive power and water shortages. So the officials in San Francisco requested the construction of a hydroelectric dam and reservoir in the Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite National Park, which is relatively nearby. Pinchot, again, previous guy, supported this because it used land for the most people, for the good of the most people, because that is, by definition, conservation. Conservation is using natural land to help people as efficiently as possible, not just like, again, don't clear cut a forest because it's wasting it, but you can certainly use the lumber. However, there was the naturalist John Moore, who was the guy who established Yosemite National Park, was against this, calling it ravaging commercialism. This rivalry cost a 7-year, basically, court battle before it was finally figured out. Pinshot ended up winning, so the reservoir and dam were built. However, it created environmentalism as something political, which is why today, when you're like, hey, maybe we shouldn't dump toxic waste into the river that we're drinking out of, people are like, oh, you're just a hippie that doesn't like progression for capitalism. It's like, I like to drink water and not die. But, whatever. That's why, global warming is a dirty word for some reason. Of course, though, all of this was how it was going to affect white Americans. The Mono Lake Poites, I used to know how to pronounce that. I lost it at some point. There was a group of Native Americans who lived in Yosemite, in that valley, who had to evacuate because when you build a dam, it floods the valley. That's how dams work. There was certainly no concern whatsoever about what was going to happen to them because, well, these are white men arguing over how things are going to affect white people. So, more images. This is San Francisco after the earthquake and its subsequent fires. It looks like images I will have for you guys about World War II. It looks like a city that's been bombed. Several images of the city looks like it has been bombed. This is actually a pretty famous image where you've got like the fronts of the buildings that have fallen out, and then down the hill is the city on fire because, again, it broke the gas lines and also the water lines, so everything's on fire and you can't do anything about it. Which, again, here as well, there's nothing to be done. Again, this feels like something that I accidentally pulled out of my World War II folder, but it's not. This is San Francisco. And then some of their rebuilding. Here is Hetch Hetchy Valley, before, obviously, the building of the dam. And here it is after. I would say here it is today, but considering what Lake Mead looks like today, it's probably a lot lower than this currently due to the years-long droughts happening in the West. And here's a side-by-side. So you've got, the river flowing down the middle here, and then now you've just got it completely flooded. And you can see, because these are the same mountains in the background. It's flooded about up to here, I think. Okay, you got that there, so about up to there. And then the hydroelectric dam itself, which just again shows you about how deep it is. And relatively speaking, hydroelectric dams are not the worst way to get power. You're not, dumping heavy metals into the air like you would be with, say, a coal-fired plant. You are, again, doing this, but at least as far as the production of the electricity, you're just running water through a turbine, you're turning the turbine and making electricity, and then the water that comes out is still clean. You're not doing anything to the water. You're just using it to turn a turbine. So hydroelectric dams aren't that big a deal. Again, there's an issue with the environment. It causes issues with what's the natural rivers and whatnot. But other than that, they're not awful. Could certainly be worse. Also, this is an image from the book. We've got John Moore here on the right with the big beard. They're out there at Yosemite. You can see one of the famous waterfalls there. That's got a specific name, but I don't know Yosemite Park very well. Anybody recognize the guy standing next to him? The image is a little bit dark, but that is Roosevelt. That is his good friend, Theodore Roosevelt, who, by the way, is the reason we have national parks at all. Teddy Roosevelt was again, if you know anything about Teddy Roosevelt, he was an avid outdoorsman. And he's the reason why we have national parks. Do I have? I'll get to that in a minute. So, yeah, and then we have Theodore Roosevelt, literally the next thing. So, real quick about national parks. So I talked about this in my other class, and the book doesn't really go into it, so I'm going to talk about it. Well, there's a little bit about him with conservation. I'll get to that in a minute. I got ahead of myself last time. So, Theodore Roosevelt. He was born in New York, graduated from Harvard in 1880, was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897. Apparently that wasn't good enough for him, so he formed the Rough Riders the next year to fight in Cuba against the Spanish. Became the governor of New York that same year. McKinley's vice president in 1900, so 2 years later. And then after McKinley was shot and killed the next year, became the president. So between 1897 and 1901, quite a lot happened for Theodore Roosevelt. Also, technically, that first term that he had as president was not his first term as president. He was just finishing up McKinley's. So when he ran for president later, that was technically his first term. But we'll get to that in a minute. So, after Johnson, which again we talked about like at the start of the semester, whose poor handling of the Reconstruction got him partially, at least censured by Congress. The presidents hadn't really done much since, again, literally, Lincoln. However, Roosevelt wasn't content with that. Rather than passively administering national business, Roosevelt saw the presidency as his bully pulpit, promote his reforms and rally public opinion. Now, despite Roosevelt being quite boisterous, again, if you know anything about Roosevelt, he was a character. He pushed for more moderate reforms. He disliked any kind of ideological extremism. In part, I feel like because he knew that if you push too far in one direction, it's going to cause a backlash. And also, he was just a more moderate guy. And he wanted stability, political and economic stability, because again, as we saw at the start of this chapter, due to the rapid change due to the Second Industrial Revolution, immigration, the specter of war in Europe, people were concerned about the future of the country, and so he was pushing for a stable America. So his platform was this square deal, mediated a coal miner strike in Pennsylvania, used the Sherman Antitrust Act against business trust, which, as we'd seen before, had mostly been used against, labor unions instead of actual business trusts. Such as the Northern Securities Company in 1902, which the book has a little thing on. The powerful financier behind Northern Securities, J.P. Morgan, believed that he could do business with Roosevelt as he had with previous presidents. Send your man to my man and they can fix it up, Morgan informed Roosevelt. However, the president's man at the Justice Department responded, we don't want to fix it up, we want to stop it. In 1904, the Supreme Court ordered the Northern Securities Company be dissolved, ruling the firm had restricted competition, which is what it had been doing. So Roosevelt faced down and won against the most powerful financier in the world at the time, as well as Standard Oil, which was certainly not nothing. He filed 25 suits over the course of his presidency, which earned him the title of the Trust Buster, which we'll get more into a little bit later. Here he is with the Rough Riders. Again, he stands out. This was the point that I mentioned in my other class, where I can't think of a nicer way to say this, but I mean this in the nicest way possible because I do really like Teddy Roosevelt. He's a cartoon character. He is, I mean, both his personality, but also just like his physicality. He stands out so much compared to other people. Like, all these other guys are just dudes. They're your regular early 1900s guys. But then you've got Theodore Roosevelt, and he looks like he was plucked out of a comic book or something. I mean, he just stands out. And I always am reminded of, like I said, I haven't seen Night at the Museum in probably a decade, but I think it was Robin Williams that played him in Night at the Museum. And typically, I mean, again, it was a comedy movie, so there's always going to be some level of exaggeration. But then when you actually look at pictures of Roosevelt and learn about Roosevelt, it's like maybe he didn't play Roosevelt crazy enough. Maybe he was a little conservative with Roosevelt. Yeah. And then you have the actual political cartoons of Roosevelt, and it's like that's not that far off of what he actually looked like. Also, to explain this image, because the book does go into this a little bit, but I didn't actually put it in the notes. Roosevelt did differentiate between what he saw as good trust and bad trust. Those that he saw as restricting competition, he did put down. He did use the Sherman Antitrust Act to get rid of. But those he saw as being beneficial to the American people and not restricting competition, he would still put like restrictions on so that they wouldn't get out of hand, but he would leave alone, more or less. So while he was called the Trust Buster, and I think I've got an image, well, there's this one putting the screws on the trust, and you've got him in the background with his Rough Rider outfit, and also him wrestling the train trust. Here we go. There's this one where it's like oil trust and railroad trust and something else in the back, and then over here is like everything in general. That he actually wasn't that extreme. It felt like it at the time because he was going after seemingly everybody, but he was actually more nuanced than later presidents, as we're going to find out. And then we have here an image of Roosevelt as this like noble hero against these giants. I know this one over here is J.P. Morgan. I'm not sure who these other guys are. But they're all like industry leaders and, literally titans of industry, which is why the image is what it is, who are treating, Roosevelt as this inconsequential nobody, because the presidents had been that up to this point. And he's about to humble them. Okay, there's obviously more because it's Theodore Roosevelt. Obviously, while his, again, to use air quotes, first term as president was just finishing up McKinley's presidency, that was enough for people to learn who this guy was and really like him. So to actually run for president in 1904, it was very easy for him to win. He ran against Judge Alton Parker. I know nothing about Judge Alton Parker because there was no campaign whatsoever. Essentially, it was nothing. Like typically, I know a little bit about the people they run against. I don't know anything about Judge Alton Parker other than his name. And because Roosevelt won so handily, he felt more confident in continuing his campaign against the various business corruption that had taken hold in America. So he continued to fight against railroad corruption, setting maximum shipping rates and outlawing rebates, which we had seen were being used by these big railroad corporations to essentially run out smaller shippers. This is where I was going with the national park thing. Set a middle ground between conservationists and preservationists. Set aside 150 million acres of timberland for national forest, but also spent $80 million in federal funds for reservoirs, dams, canals, and the like. So that's the difference. Preservation is just you set things aside and leave them alone. Conservation is we're going to use the land as efficiently as possible for the good of the people. So the thing about the national forest, and Roosevelt specifically, is, as I said, Roosevelt was an avid outdoorsman, and specifically he was a hunter. He loved to go out and hunt. And the thing about hunters, usually, there are certain sociopaths like my uncle that just like to murder things, but most hunters are as concerned about the environment that the animals are living in as they are about actually going out and hunting the animals themselves. So the thing about Roosevelt, he had seen what had happened to animals in the past. Like, for example, we had wolves all over this country for hundreds of years until they were almost completely wiped out. We had bison as far west as the Appalachian Mountains until European settlers happened. And so Roosevelt created these national parks to keep these animals from going extinct, but also so that they could still be hunted in moderation. That's why, for example, when you have like deer season or duck season or whatever, you can only hunt a certain number of them because you don't want people to just go out and wipe them out, because A, you don't want the species to go extinct, but also B, if someone goes out and kills, 30, there's not any left for anybody else. And then it's going to affect the whole environment and affect more than just the species that got wiped out. So Roosevelt literally created these parks to preserve the animals so that he could continue hunting. And to use an example that I learned about, I guess it's been a decade ago now. There is this duck hunters group. It's like, I don't know if it's international or if it's just American based, but it's this huge duck hunters group. It's got thousands of members, and they fund heated ponds in the northern parts of the country where ducks can, when they're migrating, can like land and rest during the migration, because during duck migration, a number of them die. They just not able to make it because it's an arduous process. But if they have these stopover points, then more of them survive. Therefore, the duck population is able to grow larger because more of them make it to their nesting grounds and they can reproduce. So these people whose whole thing is hunting ducks also spend a ton of their time and money to make sure there are more ducks. They're not just dudes that go out and shoot ducks. They're also make sure that there's more ducks. So that's an interesting thing. But like I said, growing up, a few people in my family hunted, and I didn't know anything beyond that. So that was just sort of a new thing for me to learn. So I always like to include that when we talk about this part. Some more reform. Congress did some reform in 1906. This was when Upton Sinclair's The Jungle was published. We talked about this at the start of this chapter. Caught out the dangerous and filthy conditions of the meatpacking facilities, which were terrible. These larger firms also wanted this regulation because literally Europe refused to purchase canned meat from the U.S. because it was tainted. It was literally like, you know how sometimes stuff in America, or just in the world, gets recalled because of E. coli? Yeah, that was like extremely minor compared to what was happening in this canned meat stuff. Besides the fact that it was potentially poisoned. Actually, yeah, hold on. The book here mentions, revealed in grisly detail how the meat cut up for sausage, quote, will be dosed with borax and glycerin and dumped into hoppers and made over again for home consumption. And also the fact that due to the non-existent safety, sometimes people would lose fingers and that would just end up in the meat. So again, this regulation would improve conditions in these meatpacking plants, which meant that Europe would buy our meat again, and also would shut out the smaller meatpacking businesses, which, like, A, it sucks that the smaller businesses can't compete with the bigger businesses, but B, you don't want your food to be dangerous to eat. So, you know. Congress also passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which prohibited the sale of adulterated and fraudulently labeled food and medicine. So cool, they have to actually tell you what's in your food and medicine. That's when this was passed. So that's when you get, like, you know, really any food or medicine, you've got like that list of what's in it. That's when this was made a thing. Anyway, here's Theodore Roosevelt with the pelican. I particularly like this image because if you know anything about pelicans, if they can fit it in their mouth, they will attempt to, including people's faces. So it's interesting to see him just sort of hanging out with a pelican. Surprised it's not trying to eat his face. Here he is discussing conservation. Conservation means development as much as it does protection. I recognize the right and duty of this generation to develop and use the natural resources of our land, but I do not recognize the right to waste them or to rob by wasteful use the generations that come after us. Boy, it sure would be nice if people thought like that these days, instead of, you know, destroying the land and water and air with data centers for AI shit. But, you know, whatever. I don't know. I'm just a college professor. Meatpacking plants. As they say, if you like sausage, don't watch it being made, because it is it's concerning. Also, there was like very little, if any, refrigeration in these places, so it was concerning. Oh, and another one of my favorite images: cocaine toothache drops. If your child has a toothache, instantaneous cure. Give them a little cocaine. It will take care of it. For sale by all druggists, because pharmacist wasn't really a thing yet. Yeah. Oh, also, sort of on the same topic there, old Coca-Cola. I'm sure everyone's heard Coca-Cola should have cocaine in it. Not exactly. It was made with the same plant. It used the coca plant in Coca-Cola. They didn't like refine cocaine, like the powder, and then dump it into the vat while Coca-Cola was being made. That's that's not what was going on. But it 100% had the like active ingredient in it. So there was issues with, quote, original Coca-Cola. Satisfies the thirsty and helps the weary. Yeah, it'll certainly perk you up. Anyway, we will finish with the last couple of slides next time. And then we'll do the study guide, I guess, next Wednesday. So, yeah, I'll see y'all next week. Have a good weekend. I'll get this put up on Blackboard.